It started with a sound, not loud, but sharp enough to slip into your ears and linger there. I was halfway through the door, shaking the raindrops off my jacket, when I heard it. It was a voice you can never forget, my mother's, rising and falling, her words interrupted by something heavy, something full of anger, something that felt like an accusation. The word betrayal sliced through the air like broken glass. I froze. Sure, my parents had argued before. Every family has those moments, the small disagreements about dinner plans, what movie to watch, or whose turn it was to fix the leaky faucet. But this was different. It wasn't the quiet hum of frustration I was used to. This was raw, real, and terrifying. I dropped my keys into the bowl by the door and crept into the hallway. Their bedroom door was ajar, spilling a thin strip of yellow light into the otherwise dark corridor. I told myself not to look, not to get involved, but my legs betrayed me and carried me closer. My heart raced, drowning out the rain tapping against the windows. How long? My mother's voice cracked. How long have you been lying to me? My father's reply was low, almost inaudible, but it carried a weight that I could feel. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. His tone, equal parts exhaustion and defiance, spoke volumes. Something irreparable had snapped between them. I leaned against the wall, trying to make sense of it. Was it money? Something at work? Another woman? My head spun with questions I wasn't ready to answer. Then I heard footsteps, my father's heavy stride, snapping me back to the present. I stumbled back, breath catching in my throat, as he threw the door open. His eyes met mine for a split second, not angry or upset, but hollow, like he'd run out of energy to feel anything. Without a word, he grabbed his coat from the hook by the door and stepped into the rain. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother stayed behind the half-open door, and I stood frozen in the hallway, unsure whether to go to her or pretend I hadn't seen anything. The house felt colder, darker, as if all the warmth had been sucked out with that one unresolved moment. I decided to stay still, my back against the wall. Moments later, my mother appeared, her face carefully composed, though the redness around her eyes gave her away. She tried to smile when she saw me, but it was a smile that never reached her eyes. "Sweetheart," she said softly, her voice trembling just enough for me to catch. "We'll talk about this later, okay?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She reached out as if to touch my shoulder, but stopped halfway, letting her hand fall back to her side. Then she walked past me, heading to the kitchen. I stayed there, frozen, trying to process everything. My father was gone. My mother was upset. Whatever had just happened between them wasn't going to be fixed by morning. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene over and over in my head. The rain had softened to a gentle drizzle, its steady rhythm tapping against my window, but it did nothing to calm the storm brewing inside me. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think straight. And worst of all, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything I thought I knew about my family was about to change forever. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee brewing downstairs and the faint sound of a radio playing in the kitchen. For a moment, I thought maybe everything was fine, that the argument I'd overheard was just another fleeting disagreement. But when I saw the empty space in the driveway where my father's car usually sat, reality crashed back in. I walked downstairs cautiously, the tension thick in the air. My mother was at the counter, pouring herself a cup of coffee, but she seemed different. Her usual neat bun was messy, stray strands of hair falling across her face. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the sugar. She didn't notice me at first, or maybe she pretended not to. "Good morning," I said hesitantly. She looked up, startled, and forced a small smile. "Morning, sweetheart. Did you sleep okay?" "Not really," I replied, sharper than I intended. I wanted to ask her what had happened, why Dad had left, but the question felt too heavy for the kitchen. She hesitated, like she knew what I wanted to ask but wouldn't give me an answer. Instead, she said, "Why don't we go for a walk later? By the lake. We could use some fresh air." I nodded. It was easier than arguing. The lake was only a 10-minute walk from our house, a quiet spot surrounded by tall trees and the occasional picnic table. It was one of my mother's favorite places. She always said it helped her think. I wasn't sure what there was to think about now. Dad was gone, and no amount of fresh air was going to change that. We walked in silence for most of the way, the gravel crunching under our shoes. I kept waiting for her to say something, to explain, but the words didn't come until we reached the edge of the water. "I know you're upset," she began, her voice steady but soft. "And you have every right to be. Things between your father and me, they haven't been easy for a while." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. She sighed, staring at the ripples on the lake. "Marriage is complicated. People change. Sometimes, no matter how hard you try, things just don't go back to the way they used to be." Her words felt rehearsed, like she'd spent the whole morning practicing them, but they didn't explain anything. They didn't tell me why Dad had left or why she looked like she hadn't slept at all. Before I could ask more, her phone buzzed. She pulled it from her pocket, glanced at the screen, and immediately declined the call. I caught a glimpse of the name, unknown, before she slipped it back into her jacket. "It's nothing," she said quickly, noticing my gaze, but her hands were shaking again. By the time we got home, the air between us was heavier than before. I retreated to my room, desperate for space, but the unease wouldn't leave me. I kept thinking about her phone, the way she brushed off that call. Something didn't add up. That evening, I stepped outside to clear my head. The backyard was quiet, the kind of peaceful that made it hard to believe anything was wrong. I walked toward the garden, letting the cool air calm my nerves. Then I saw her. My mother was standing near the gate, talking to someone. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark coat. His back was to me, but I could hear the rumble of his voice, though I couldn't make out the words. My mother looked tense, her arms tightly crossed over her chest. I moved closer, staying hidden behind the corner of the house. Their conversation grew more animated. He said something that made her shake her head, and then he reached out, brushing her hand. She didn't pull away. Then he leaned in. His lips brushed hers, just barely, as if testing the waters. For a moment, she hesitated, but then she kissed him back. It wasn't long, barely a second, but it was enough. Enough to twist my stomach into knots. I must have made a sound, a gasp, a step back, because she turned suddenly, her eyes locking onto mine. Her face drained of color. "Wait," she called out, but I was already walking away, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was inside. The door slammed shut behind me. She came to my room an hour later, knocking softly before letting herself in. I was sitting on the bed, arms wrapped around my knees, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I looked up at her, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "Then what is it? Because it sure looked like you were kissing some random guy while Dad's. I don't even know where he is." She flinched but didn't deny it. Instead, she sat down next to me, keeping a careful distance between us. "I made a mistake," she said, finally. "A big one. I'll explain everything, I promise. But you have to trust me." "How am I supposed to trust you after that?" My voice cracked, and I hated how fragile I sounded. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached toward me, as if she meant to take my hand but stopped herself. "Just give me some time," she said, her voice soft but pleading. I couldn't speak. I just stood there, feeling as if everything around me had suddenly fallen apart. The silence between us grew thick as she left, closing the door behind her, but her words, "Give me time," kept echoing in my head. I didn't know if there was any time left to give. The day after everything in the backyard, I woke up feeling as if I'd been through a battle. My body felt heavy, weighed down, and my mind kept replaying that image of my mother kissing that man. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make sense of it. And then there was Dad, gone, without a word, leaving a quiet that felt almost suffocating. Downstairs, the house was eerily still. My mother was sitting at the dining table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, likely long cold by now. When I entered, she looked up, her eyes searching mine as if looking for something. Maybe understanding, maybe forgiveness. "Good morning," she said, her voice barely holding together. I ignored her greeting, grabbed a piece of toast from the counter. The tension in the room felt thick, but I wasn't ready to talk about what I'd witnessed, not yet. After a long silence, she suggested, "How about we go out for breakfast? Just the two of us? There's a new cafe on." "I'm busy," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I meant. It wasn't that I had something else to do. It was that I couldn't sit across from her and pretend that everything was okay. Her face dropped, but she didn't argue. Instead, she nodded, her fingers clutching her mug tightly. "Okay," she whispered. Later that afternoon, I reached my breaking point. I couldn't just stay at home, waiting. I knew my mom wouldn't give me any answers, so I did the only thing I could think of. I texted Dad. "Where are you?
Can we talk?"
The little 3 dots appeared almost instantly, and then disappeared. I stared at my phone, willing him to answer. Finally, his message came. "I'm fine. Let's talk soon." It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me anxious. Fine didn't tell me anything, and soon was far too vague. In frustration, I tossed my phone onto the bed and started pacing, trying to figure out what to do next. And then it hit me, the man, the one from the backyard. Whoever he was, he knew something, and if my mother wasn't going to tell me, maybe he would. The next day, I decided to follow her. It wasn't hard to track her. She left around lunchtime, dressed in her usual jeans and jacket, and headed into town. I kept a safe distance, making sure not to draw her attention. My heart raced as I trailed behind her down the main street, past cafes and small shops. She eventually stopped at a small cafe on the corner, a place with large windows and tables spilling out onto the sidewalk. And there he was, the man from the backyard. He was already sitting at a table near the back, his hands casually resting on the edge. My mother entered, greeted him with a nod, and sat down. They started talking almost immediately, their heads close together. I slipped inside, pretending to look at the pastry counter, and found a seat just close enough to overhear them. The cafe was bustling, and their voices were quiet, but I managed to catch enough to make my stomach churn. "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this," my mother said, her voice exhausted, defeated. "You're doing the right thing," the man replied, calm and reassuring. "It's better this way. For everyone." "For everyone?" she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "You have no idea what it's like, keeping secrets from your own child." That made me stop dead in my tracks.
"They were talking about me."
The man leaned in, lowering his voice even further. I strained to hear, but all I caught was, "If she finds out." By the time they left, I was burning with questions. What was going on? What were they hiding from me? And why was this man so involved in my family's life? I waited until my mother drove off before walking up to him. "Excuse me?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned, clearly surprised. "Can I help you?" I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what exactly to say. But then the anger and confusion hit me about my father, my mother's lies, and everything I wasn't being told. "I need to know who you are." For a second, he looked like he might walk away, but then he sighed and gestured toward a nearby bench. "Let's sit," he said. I followed him, my heart hammering in my chest. He didn't speak right away. He just watched the cars drive by, like he was deciding how much to reveal. "My name is David," he finally said. "I'm a friend of your mother's." "A friend?" I repeated, disbelief clear in my voice. "Is that what you call sneaking around behind her family's back?" He winced but didn't deny it. "It's not what you think," he said. "I'm just trying to help her. Your parents are going through a tough time, and I'm just offering support." "Support," I said, the word coming out flat. "By meeting her in secret?" I couldn't finish the sentence. The image of their kiss was still too vivid in my mind. "It's complicated," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "Your mother is struggling. So is your father. But they both care about you. That hasn't changed." His words didn't help. They only raised more questions. What kind of support could my mother possibly need that she couldn't get from her own family? And why did it feel like I was the last to know what was going on? When I got home, my mother was sitting on the couch, hands folded neatly in her lap. As soon as I entered, she looked up at me. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice tight. "I could ask you the same thing," I shot back. Her face faltered, but she didn't say anything. I dropped my bag on the floor and crossed my arms, ready to stand my ground. "I talked to him," I said, finally. "David, or whatever his name is." Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked genuinely scared. But then she took a deep breath, straightened up, and said, "We need to talk." "Yeah," I replied coldly. "We do." The silence between us was deafening, but this time, I wasn't going to back down. The tension in the house was unbearable by the time my mother finally broke the silence. She knocked on my bedroom door one evening, her voice soft but insistent. "Can I come in?" I hesitated for a moment, then opened the door just enough to see her standing there, holding a program with her name and my father's printed on the cover. I already knew what she was going to say before the words left her lips. "I want you to come to our show tonight," she said carefully, like she was testing the waters. "Your father and I are performing together again." That stopped me in my tracks. I hadn't seen them perform in years. Acting had always been their shared passion, the way they communicated when words fell short. But lately, it seemed like they couldn't even stand to be in the same room. The idea of them being on stage together felt almost impossible. I crossed my arms, confused. "Why now?" She offered a small, tired smile. "Because it's important, to me, to your father, to us. As a family, we want you there." There was something in her voice, maybe hope, or maybe desperation. Either way, I couldn't refuse. Deep down, I wanted to believe that this could be a step toward fixing whatever had broken between them. That evening, the theater hummed with excitement as I found my seat near the front. The space felt familiar, but also strange, like it had shrunk since the last time I was there. As the house lights dimmed, a hush fell over the audience. The curtain rose, and there they were, my parents, stepping onto the stage together. For a moment, it was as if time had reversed. The past few weeks didn't exist anymore. They looked poised, confident, moving in sync, their chemistry undeniable. They were performing a classic drama about love and loss. Their energy on stage was electric, pulling the audience in. As I watched them, a flicker of pride surged within me. They weren't just my parents, they were artists. They had the ability to transform pain into something beautiful. Their voices filled the theater, thick with emotion, and I was swept up in the story they were telling. Halfway through the play, there was a scene where my father's character reached for my mother's hand. She hesitated, just for a moment before taking it. It was subtle, but the tension between them was clear. It wasn't just acting. It was real, raw, and I couldn't tell where the performance ended and the truth began. When the scene ended, the applause was thunderous. After the show, I waited for them in the lobby, surrounded by the buzz of other audience members. My mother was the first to spot me. Her face brightened when she saw me, and she walked over eagerly. "Well?" she asked, her voice tinged with nervous excitement. "What did you think?" "It was amazing," I replied, meaning every word. "You both were amazing." My father joined us then, his expression a bit guarded, but not unfriendly. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. For the first time in weeks, we stood together without the weight of unspoken words hanging over us. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Later that night, my mother knocked on my door again. This time, when she entered, she looked different, determined, not nervous. "I want to explain everything," she said, sitting on the edge of my bed. "About David, about your father, about everything." My heart began to pound in my chest. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. She took a deep breath before speaking. "Your father and I have been struggling for a long time. We thought that working together again might help us reconnect, but it's not that simple." "What about David?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "What does he have to do with all of this?" Her expression softened, and she looked almost ashamed. "David is a friend. He's been helping me through some of the things I haven't been able to talk about with your father. It wasn't supposed to be anything more, but I made a mistake. A mistake. I repeated, my chest tightening. Is that what you call kissing him? Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't look away. I'm not proud of it. And I didn't mean for you to see that, but it made me realize how much I still care about your father. How much I want to fix things. Her honesty took me by surprise. I wasn't sure if I believed her, but there was something in her voice that made me want to try. The next morning, my father pulled me aside before I left for class. I heard your mother talk to you last night, he said, his tone measured. I just want you to know, we're both trying. For you and for us. I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything. There was still so much I didn't understand, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a small glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could get better. The days after the performance felt lighter. My parents were still navigating their way through the mess of their relationship, but something had shifted. They seemed more willing to talk, more open to trying again. And I was cautiously hopeful, though I kept my distance, unsure how much I could believe in the fragile truce between us. Then, one evening, as I was getting ready for a study session at the library, my mother called me into the living room. She was holding a small, worn envelope, her face unreadable. This came for you, she said, handing it over. I opened it carefully, my heart racing. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in a familiar handwriting, my father's. Meet me at the theater. Midnight. No explanation, no context, just those 6 words. I looked up at my mother, but she only smiled faintly. You should go, she said. The theater was dark when I arrived, empty except for the faint hum of the city outside, muffled by the thick wooden doors. I stepped inside slowly, the echo of my footsteps making the space feel even larger. The stage was lit dimly, a single spotlight casting a soft glow over its center.
Dad.
I called out, my voice trembling slightly. He stepped out from the shadows, looking more at ease than I'd seen him in months. He was holding a folded piece of paper. When he spoke, his voice was steady. I wrote something, he said. It's a scene for us. I stared at him, confused. For us? He nodded. I thought maybe we could perform it. Just once, together. I hesitated. Acting had never been my thing. It was their world, not mine. But the look in his eyes. I couldn't refuse. The script was simple. A short dialogue between a father and a daughter, trying to understand each other. As we went through the lines, something shifted. The words weren't just words anymore. They were ours. Each line we spoke felt like the wall between us was crumbling, bit by bit. By the time we reached the final line, I wasn't sure if I was still acting or if I was just saying what I'd wanted to say for weeks. I just want us to be okay, I whispered, my voice breaking. So do I, he replied, his tone soft but certain. For a moment, the theater was silent. The weight of the scene hung in the air, like a blanket. Then, slowly, he stepped forward and pulled me into a hug. The kind of hug that didn't need words, the kind that said everything. When we left the theater that night, the air felt different. Lighter. It was like the storm that had been hanging over us for so long had finally started to clear. My mother was waiting for us outside. Her expression was unreadable until she saw the look on my father's face. Then she smiled, a smile that made me believe, just for a moment, that maybe we were going to be okay. And as we walked home together, side by side, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope.